Okay, welcome everybody. We're a little bit later. There was some improvising given what was happening in our town. There's a lot of people here and a lot of people who are interested in coming into the museum today. Thank you so much for being here for the last event of the Dutch Studies Symposium called Dutch Studies Decolonial Revision. My name is Annemarie Toebos. I'm the director of the Dutch and Flemish Studies program here at the university. We started this celebration for 50 years of Dutch at this institution with an exhibit in the Hatcher Graduate Library that is going to close tomorrow. So for some people who want to still see it, this is your last chance. We had several events then in this symposium. It started on Wednesday. There was a memorial by Dutch and Navajo presidential candidate Mark Charles. That was followed by an event organized by the School of Music, Theater and Dance and the Dutch program, where people thought about different colonial instruments, a little instrument like the Carolan instrument, but also language as an instrument, and then specifically Afrikaans. So that was on Thursday. And then on Friday, accompanying amazing concert happened at noon in the Carolan Tower. And people were able to have lunch and listen to this amazing world premiere of music composed by South African composers of color, and then also different geopolitical contexts were represented in this concert on Friday. So this is our last event of the symposium. It is called On Colonial Repair, and it brings together people who are working on different contexts of colonial repair, from the museum to politics, the worlds of politics, also the courtroom. And we're also going to talk about grassroots activism and its role in repair, as well as internal individual repair. So I am going to pass the floor to my colleague, who is the Associate Director of Germanic Languages and Literatures, which the Dutch program is housed in. She is also the chair of the Museum Studies program. Professor Kirsten Barnd.
Yes, welcome. It's an honor to be here. I'm delighted to be here, to also be able to come to some of the events of this week. I would like to share my deep gratitude and admiration for the organizer of today's event and this week's events, my colleague Annemarie Toebos. Yes. As the director of our Dutch and Flemish Studies program, she has single-handedly transformed it and taken us along on her journey towards a decolonial undergraduate language program, the first of its kind on our campus and a model for others to emulate. Annemarie's tireless work has also provided us with a critical lens to celebrate the program's 50-plus birthday and to develop a vision for its future. As associate chair in the German department, as Annemarie already said, and as director of the Museum Studies program, I'm deeply impressed about the global, transdisciplinary, and intersectoral breadth of this anniversary symposium that has unfolded over the course of this week. It has featured music and museums, law and literature, as well as political, cultural, and social activism, and it has brought together guests from South Africa, Belgium, the USA, and the Netherlands. On a personal note, let me add that I'm particularly delighted and eager to hear about today's topic on colonial repair. The panel resonates with my ongoing work in Museum Studies and the Museum Studies Pro Seminar, where I get to teach to an amazing group of master's and PhD students interested in the potentialities and the problematics and critiques of museum culture. We began this year's pro-seminar in the fall term with Laura de Becker, who guided us through her 2 UMA exhibits on provenance research, restitution, and African art, Wish You Were Here, and I Write to You About Africa. Both of these exhibits are still up, and you can see them on your way out. And we will conclude the academic year with a visit by Bénédicte Savoy, who in 2018 co-authored the report on the restitution of African cultural heritage with Felvin Saar. To have both you, Bambi Köpens, and you, Christa Soeters, speak to the topic of colonial repair today, and Bénédicte Savoy within 1 week in this very same auditorium here, is a happy alignment of events that brings home how centrally issues feature in contemporary museum culture and studies. I think of them as the three, or not just three, as the capital R issues: repatriation, repair, restitution, and reparations. I couldn't be more thrilled that today's speakers will help us to unpack these concepts, their practices, relations, and ethics. I will now also introduce the moderator of today's event, my colleague Susan Page. Ambassador Susan Page is a professor of practice in international diplomacy at the Gerald R. Ford School of Public Policy's Weiser Diplomacy Center, and a professor of practice at the University of Michigan Law School. She has deep expertise in international relations, particularly in Africa, and teaches courses on Africa, international relations, human rights, and transitional justice. Prior to entering academia, Susan had a lengthy and exemplary career in the US Foreign Service and international diplomacy. Her many important positions, and I just name a few, included Special Representative of the Secretary General to the United Nations Mission for Justice Support to Haiti, First US Ambassador to newly independent South Sudan, and US Chargé d'Affaires to the African Union. Welcome, Susan and Bambi.
Thank you all very much, and thank you for putting on this really incredible program. I think closing it out with understanding of anti-colonial perspectives and the history, and especially on the 4 R's that we will talk about, is a really fitting tribute, especially to the activists such as Ms. Christa Soeters, who I am going to introduce, and I look forward to hearing her talk. Ms. Christa Soeters is an activist concerned with anti-racism and identity. She is the secretary of the Reparations Committee for Indonesians, Yayasan Komite Kehormatan Belanda, or KUKB, in case I completely butchered that, which helps victims and descendants of victims of colonial atrocities win court cases against the Dutch state. Ms. Soeters is a grassroots organizer. Her activism and initiatives have frequently put her in harm's way, but she has also centered Dutch colonial oppression on the national agenda in the Netherlands. For example, in the No May 4 for Me movement and the anti-blackface No Piet movement. She has been the victim of state repression, preventative arrest, which for those of you who understand what that means, as a lawyer, to be arrested before you have committed a crime is particularly awful. And she has been the target of threats of violence, including by convicted terrorist Vincent Tunissen. Her article, Intergenerational Trauma, is published in Histoire Bersama, a platform for anti-colonial writings about the Dutch occupation of Indonesia. Ms. Soeters is currently researching her book on the Dutch residential school system in Suriname as it connects to the cultural genocide committed in colonial residential schools worldwide. She is engaged in community building in the very small Indonesian community in the Netherlands, particularly to foster visibility and awareness through her organization Nusantara Kita. Ms. Soeters also guest lectures in the U of M Dutch and Flemish Studies program, and she has been a significant contributor to the program's redesign. So I would like to introduce to you Ms. Christa Soeters, and I would also just like to say one quick comment, which is that she will soon be taking her new name, which represents her own father's past history as a Javanese who was basically kidnapped from the island and ultimately adopted by Dutch colonial parents. And she will be taking the name Wongsodikromo. And that will be her new last name to recognize her history from her own identity. So thank you very much. I look forward to the discussion after the presentations and looking forward to getting started. Thank you.
Hello, thank you for your introduction. I'm going to talk about the 3 levels of colonial repair. So we have to make a separation between the different forms of repair and to make connections between them. So this is a picture of myself at the grave of my great-grandparents from my grandmother's side, which I'm going to talk about more in this presentation. So I'm a grassroots activist in the Netherlands, and some of my colleagues are survivors of Dutch colonial occupation in Indonesia. I am the daughter, the granddaughter, and great-granddaughter of survivors in Indonesia, Suriname, and the Netherlands. I continuously face the wall of Dutch institutional silencing and erasure in politics, by the media, and by Dutch academics. My fellow activists and I, we are the embodiment of what the Netherlands does not want to talk about. And when we speak the truth, we face situations like this.
Hallo, ik ben Christa, ik ben secretaris van Stichting KOKB. En ik heb een vraagje aan Annelot Hoek, als dat mag.
Eigenlijk niet, want jij noemt mij racist op Twitter. Dus dan houdt de discussie voor mij met jou op.
Oké, ik heb een vraagje.
So for context, I pushed through to ask my question, but the moderator actively tried to derail the process once I start challenging the system. So I'm starting with repair on individual level and my process of mental decolonization. So please make sure to make a connection of the system between the different parts of the world and the United States. So I'm a Javanese Surinamese, and to make clear, Java is an island in Indonesia, and Suriname is a country in South America. Indonesia and Suriname both got colonized by the Dutch, and after slavery got abolished in 1873, the Dutch needed new workers to work on the plantations. So first, people from India, because the British already got a system of contract labor, and after that, they took my grandparents from Indonesia. So my great-grandparents were kidnapped in 1930 from Indonesia, and they took 3 children with them, and 2 children got left behind in Indonesia. And the trip took 1.5 months by boat, and many people died on the ships during these trips. So here you see 2 pictures of my great-grandparents when they arrived in Suriname. And it's documented that on the left, my great-grandfather, he is 16 years old, and my great-grandmother, she is 18 years old. And these are my great-grandparents from my grandfather's side. So the great-grandparents I'm talking about is mostly from my grandmother's side. And we think that my great-grandparents on these pictures were younger than that. But the Dutch often gave them higher ages to legalize the kidnapping. And under colonial occupation, the births weren't reported and documented. So that's why the Dutch could easily change our ages and our names. So after we got from the plantations, we had to survive again. During the colonial occupation in Indonesia, we weren't allowed to go to school for 350 years. So that means we couldn't read and we couldn't write. We had our own Javanese script, but we couldn't write or read the Latin script. In Java, we were mostly traders and we were farmers. But for the Dutch, these are substandard jobs. So the thought was, if you want to improve your living conditions, you have to learn the colonizers' language and the colonizers' writing. So our traditional ways of documenting was telling stories through music, through dance and theater. But documenting through writing was made superior by, and the only legitimate way by the colonizers. So as Sandhu Hera says, the colonizer took possession of the knowledge production. So to learn all these skills to survive in this new society of a nation of stolen people, the Islamic Javanese were converted and sent to Christian boarding schools. So we had to unlearn our savage culture and received physical punishment when we talked our own language or when we practiced our Javanese culture. So our identity has been made traumatizing. We've learned to hate our own identity and to hate ourselves and even each other. So here you see a picture of some Javanese at a Surinamese boarding school with a quote saying, "It wasn't easy at first to eat with knife and fork, as if we were animals." So not long ago, I talked with my aunt, and she said she wasn't allowed to talk Javanese at home. So she learned how to communicate in her own language. So she couldn't communicate with her own grandparents. So as you can see, we didn't only get separated by land, but also from our families by language. And here you see two photographs of my family. On the left, you see my great-grandmother and my grandmother with two little boys. And my grandmother is holding my father. And my great-grandmother is holding my uncle. And these two boys are twins. So on the picture on the left, you see a Dutch Christian missionary couple. And my father got adopted by this Christian missionary couple, and the picture on the left it symbolizes that my father's given away, and that my uncle that he stayed in Suriname with my great grandmother. So I don't really know why he got adopted. Maybe because the whites were seen as superior. But the circumstances of this adoption was because of the colonial occupation. So Suriname got independent in 1975, and that makes me the first generation that didn't live under colonial occupation. This missionary couple, they went first to Papua in Indonesia to work on boarding schools over there and to save the Papuan people from their own culture. And there they adopted my aunt. That's the little girl the man is holding. She's from Papua. And after that, they went to Suriname to work on the boarding schools over there. So here you see a connection between the school system, the boarding school system, between Asia and South America. So this missionary couple, they also adopted children from Sri Lanka, from Indonesia, from Suriname, from Curaçao. And these countries were occupied by the Dutch. So it's a little bit sensitive to say this in my family, but to me it's like they collected these children like a colonial collection. So colonialism really torn. In 2019, I went to Indonesia to meet my family for the first time. And it was very emotional to meet them. And a lot of Surinamese, they don't know who their families are and where their families are. So I'm very privileged to know this. I'm also the first of my generation to meet my family in Indonesia. I think it's important that as the younger generation to keep the family ties connected and to talk with the elders, because they have a lot of information, and they have all the information that keeps the family ties connected. So I think it's important to pass this information on to the younger generation so we don't forget who we are. So my family lives in Indonesia. They live in the same village as my great-grandparents lived before they were kidnapped from Indonesia to Suriname. And I visited the location their house was built on, and I took soil from the ground, and I took it back home to the Netherlands. So a few months later, I visited Suriname, and the biggest dream of my great-grandparents was to go back to Indonesia, but they weren't able to go. This was because of the relationship between the Netherlands and Indonesia, because Indonesia got independent in 1945, and also because of the Second World War that happened between. And my great-grandparents were kidnapped in 1930, and also because they didn't earn a lot of money, it's hard to survive. They couldn't pay for their trip back to Indonesia. So I took the soil from their home in Indonesia and I mixed it with the soil of their graves. I did this to show respect and because honoring our ancestors is very important in our culture. So meeting my family in Suriname and Indonesia is part of reclaiming my identity, and it's a form of personal reparation. So now I'm going to talk about repair on a collective level. I think it's important to share the knowledge and the healing with the community. So the community takes care of me, and I think it's important for the individual to give it back to the community, to the collective. And when you don't do the ego work as an individual, it can be very dangerous to the collective, especially in the activist movement. So it started in 2013 when the debate about Zwarte Piet was going on. A lot of racism became visible, and I started to connect the dynamics of oppression. And through activists, a lot of information became accessible to me, and it was at that time I could really understand why I am Indonesian from Suriname. Because the history isn't taught in school. For a long time, I didn't know who I was. So at this time, I began understanding about the Japanese Surinamese identity. And the picture on the right is a protest against the Dutch Memorial Day. I received a lot of violence when I protested against it. I said the 2 minutes of silence is hypocrite. The Dutch commemorate the perpetrators during the War for Independence in Indonesia, but they don't commemorate the Indonesian victims, which were Dutch citizens at that time, because the Dutch refused to acknowledge the 17th of August 1945 as the Indonesian Independence Day. which is very racist. So at that time, it was very dangerous to talk about racism. A man was sentenced 3 years in jail for planning a terrorist attack on Muslims, and he wanted to kidnap, gang rape me, and shoot a bullet through my head. I didn't know about all of this until I started Googling myself. So the police didn't contact me or anything about this. The violence I receive is exceptional. It is because I face racism and sexism at the same time. So as a non-white person, I dare to speak up about Dutch traditions, and I am a woman at the same time, which makes the aggression go double. And now I want to talk about the racial hierarchy in Indonesia during the colonial occupation. So to keep the economic and political power by the elite, they implemented a racial hierarchy or an apartheid system. So the top layer were the Europeans. It consists of the white Europeans and the mixed race people that got equalized by law as Europeans. So the mixed race people had to have a European father. The mother could be Indo-European or indigenous, but if the mother was white and the father was Indonesian, then the children couldn't get equalized by law. So it had to go through the father. And this top layer were the oppressors during the colonial occupation. And the second layer of the hierarchy consists of the foreign Easterners. These were the traders like the Arab people, people from India and from China. And the bottom layer consists of the indigenous people. At that time, it's called inlander, which is a slur. We didn't have any rights in this apartheid system. So when Indonesia got independent, there were around 400,000 Europeans and 70 to 100 million indigenous people. And here you see some terminology. Indies and Indo versus Indonesian and Dutch Indies versus Indonesia. It's more like a colonial versus anti-colonial terminology. And most of the people know these pictures from the United States on the top left. So South Africa on the top right, and Nazi Germany on the bottom right. And on the bottom left, this is in Indonesia, with a sign forbidden for dogs and inlanders. So here you can see the connection and the pattern of this apartheid system around the world. So a year ago, I joined the foundation Komite Utang Kehormatan Belanda as a secretary that was founded by Jeffrey Pondag. The foundation is known for its successful lawsuits against the Dutch state, and we promote the interests of the 7,000 conscientious objectors. So the recognition of 17th of August as the date of independence of Indonesia is also highly on our agenda. The Netherlands still doesn't recognize this date. And we have won a lot of lawsuits against the Dutch state. The first one was Rawa Gede, in which 431 men were killed. So imagine how almost all the men of an entire village got wiped out. So on the logo of the foundation, you see on the bottom left, you see a picture of Lambogo. He was beheaded by the Dutch colonial army. His head was displayed on a bayonet in front of a market, and all the men had to kiss the head in front of all the women and children of that village. We won the court case, and Lambogo's son received 847 euros and 80 cents. This amount is an insult to the family in Indonesia, to the Indonesian family, and he returned the money as a protest. So on the left of the logo, you see two children of South Sulawesi. And the conclusion of the lawsuits is that the court cases are colonial. Colonization is an important part of the nation forming of the Netherlands. So civilization creates legal systems to keep society well organized, but the Netherlands became a wealthy nation because of colonialism. So the legal system is created to legitimize colonialism and to protect colonial values. So the judge is talking about legitimate combat acts. A legitimate combat act is when an Indonesian who wants to be free after 350 years of a colonial occupation wants to pick up a weapon, for example. So according to the Dutch colonial judge, the Dutch army is allowed to kill these people. The point is, where does the Dutch take the right to invade a country and to occupy it for 350 years, to kill the indigenous people, to commit genocide, steal the resources, and steal the people, and to steal labor? The whole presence of the Dutch is illegitimate, but the court gives the colonial army the right to kill these people, who did nothing wrong but wanting to be free. So what we need is a separate court and an anti-colonial lawyer who isn't afraid to address the colonial system, because they want to isolate the period between 45-49 as a war, and leaving out the entire colonial occupation of 350 years. And addressing the 350 years of colonial occupation is important because during the occupation, we didn't have any rights. So our work has led to apologies from the king, financial compensation, and removal of the golden coach from the streets. But we don't acknowledge these acts as reparations. The reason of the low financial compensation is because they are holding onto colonial laws. They are calculating the financial losses the Indonesian had because of the loss of their father. But during a colonial oppressive system, we had a low income. We couldn't earn a lot of money because we were oppressed and exploited. We weren't allowed to go to school or to have higher function, to have a higher income. So of course the financial loss is low. We hadn't had any rights then, and we don't have any rights now because the court is holding on to the colonial laws. That's why it's important to have a lawyer who dares to address the colonial system. So, here you see a picture of the Dutch king and the Indonesian president. The king apologized for the excessive violence between 45 and 49. But he didn't apologize for the 350 years of colonization. And with the term excessive violence, he is legitimizing colonial violence, of colonialism. Because when he's apologizing for excessive violence, does that mean normal violence is okay? He's only apologizing for excessive violence. So the work of KUKB is a form of collective reparations. It's not all about the money. It's not all about the money. The victims of the Dutch colonial violence want acknowledgement for the Dutch crimes. We want to make colonialism illegal. So this recognition is important on global level. It's part of individual repair, and it raises awareness for the collective. So I want to show you these pictures to get a perspective on the size of the Netherlands and Indonesia, and how the wealth of such a big country is stolen and put into a small country of the Netherlands for hundreds of years. Indonesia also had to pay for their independence. The Netherlands didn't accept their date of independence, and instead of that, the Dutch blackmailed Indonesia and recognizes the transfer of sovereignty on 27th of December 1949. Indonesia was supposed to be divided into federal states under the Dutch crown, just like the Caribbean islands that are still colonized by the Dutch. The Netherlands didn't want to lose their colony, so they set up some separatist movements like the RMS in the South Moluccas and Free West Papua. Through divide and conquer, the people with European status that were loyal to the Dutch started separatist movements because they wanted to stay under the Dutch flag, of course. Luckily, Sukarno, our first president, managed to break the divide and conquer dynamic, and he kicked out the colonizers of the entire archipelago. So Indonesia is the only colony of the Netherlands that fought themselves free, and we are very proud of that, and we are very thankful of that. But instead of the Netherlands paying reparations, Indonesia had to pay 4.5 billion guilders to the Netherlands to be free. So this is how I compare when slavery got abolished in Suriname. The enslaved Afro-Surinamese people had to work 10 years and be 10 years more, and the slave masters received a financial compensation for their loss. After calculation, the financial gains by the Netherlands from Indonesia is estimated around 103 billion euros, and that is around $112 billion. The Netherlands wanted Indonesia to pay for their own slaughter between 45 and 49, and the amount of money that Indonesia paid is around the same amount as the Marshall Plan. So after Second World War II, Indonesia paid the Netherlands for the reconstruction after World War II and the industrialization of the port of Rotterdam. The recognition of 17th of August 1945 can cost the Netherlands a lot of money. That will mean they probably have to pay the 4.5 billion guilders back, and that will mean they attacked a sovereign nation after 45, which is a war crime. So after you know how big Indonesia is in comparison with the Netherlands, I want to show you this map to get a perspective on the distances. So in pink, you see the map of the world, and in blue, you see what's on the other side of the world. We also have to know that colonialism is a global system. If we want to talk about repair and reparations, we need to think and talk about this on a global level. Colonialism is the globalization of an economic system. We call that economic system capitalism. And the economic and political power is held by the ruling class, segregated by race. Colonialism is how the wealth of one world is being transported to another world, to the West. So the West Europeans created this system over hundreds of years. And this system is integrated in every layer, even in our minds. It's also a psychological system. It makes sure that we cannot use our senses anymore to hear and to see the colonial system. The United States is the first active colony I have ever visited. So when I arrived here for the first time, I wanted my friend to take me to the countryside because I wanted to see how people were actually building houses and building new settlements. So Sukarno, the first president of Indonesia, really understood the reparation on global level. He was one of the organizers of the Bandung Conference. It's a conference of several Asian and American countries that were mostly newly independent. So here's a speech of Sukarno at the United Nations in 1960.
Let us face the fact that this organization, in its present methods and by its present form, is a product of the Western state system. Pardon me, but I cannot regard that system with reverence. I cannot even regard it with very much affection. The Western state system has torn itself to shreds and once almost destroyed the world in bitter conflict. Can you wonder that so many of us look at this organization, which is also a product of the Western state system, with a question in our eyes, but we are determined that our nations and the world as a whole shall not be the plaything of one small corner of the world. We do not seek to defend the world we know. We seek to build a better world.
So 5 years later, he got overthrown with the CIA involved. A Western-friendly puppet, Suharto, was installed in Indonesia, lived under military dictatorship for 31 years. It is estimated that 3 million people died in less than a year. Most of them were communists, which left the country to deal with a huge trauma again. So after political independence comes economic independence. But the colonial empire has never fallen. The colonial system updates all the time. Like my great-grandparents were kidnapped from Indonesia to work on the plantations in Suriname after the abolishment of slavery. We need to understand that colonialism is not over and that the United States is the pumping heart of the colonial empire. The whole world is getting colonized by the United States, but it's also a colony itself. Anti-racist policies in the United States are not going to do anything when the purpose is not anti-occupation. These policies are only an update of the system. It's intersectional imperialism and intersectional done by a non-white person with a rainbow flag. We have to build a world anew if we want to fight for reparations on a global level, and we have to start with the United States. Its priorities is the liberation of land. Thank you.
What, Christa, you are talking about is reparations for individuals and the trauma. So we're linking trauma, although yours is specifically to art, different kinds of art. Obviously, when you speak about the trauma, generational trauma, and even the fear of a new trauma, but we are so often linked by our legal system to think of repair as monetary. But in the case of people, when you do an insurance claim, it's all about, okay, what's your longevity? What is the risk of loss of income? And the calculation, as you have said, if based on an unequal system at the time, colonialism, the lack of ability to earn, what are some of the other ways that people could be repaired to receive some of that restorative justice that is not only monetary? So you mentioned an apology, the small amount of money that is given, people not wanting, it's an insult. What are some of the ways that we could that countries could do a better job of reparations?
Yeah, so first of all, the apologies that the king made, it doesn't mean anything because there are no consequences of the apologies. So the apologies are empty. And what has to happen is that we need a separate court. So I'm an activist, but I'm also revolutionary minded. So that means that we don't necessarily have to move within the frames of the system. We can work for a separate court. We can do that. So that's what we're looking for, how we can do that.
So maybe it doesn't need to be a court at all, since you can look at all kinds of different systems. And as you mentioned, reparations were paid by the Indonesians themselves for the freedom that they had literally won and suffered from. So there are communities in lots of places that have been given some sort of reparations. We don't talk about it very often, but even in the United States, there are communities and societies that have had reparations, but when it comes to, reparations for enslaved people, oh no, we can't do that. That's much too complicated, even though it wasn't complicated.
Well, it's not complicated at all, because in my presentation...
No, I'm agreeing.
Because the whole reparation for slavery, it is part of this global economic system, and it is hard to calculate the amount of money that has to pay back for hundreds of years, but we don't have to focus only on that, but we have to focus on what system is built, what kind of economic and political system is built over hundreds of years, and how, and focus on that. How can we change that? Just like Sukarno said, we need to build a world anew.
Right, so let's talk about this world where maybe there would be some more equality in the balance of power. So what kind of new world would be created in reconstituting a system?
Yeah, that's very hard, because also like in Indonesia we got these separatist movements, and we can talk about who are we to say what they have, how they deal with that. So a lot of education is needed, a lot of because this is colonial trauma, so that there has to be education on that, and that's education more on, because colonialism, it is layered in different layers. It's layered on a social level, it's layered on a political level, economic level, geographic level. So, and we have to really to make this clear on what, on every level, how healing needs to be happening, because there's not one way to do this.
So let me try to connect the artistic aspect. This is very difficult because, in talking about trauma, as a Black American, I have seen all of these things, but I also know I wouldn't want to be my ancestors as well. So
why not?
Because of the trauma that they experienced in ways that were what I would consider much worse. But at the same time, we have to constantly renew and not take for granted what maybe we thought were guarantees. So when you talk about statues, monuments, and the colonial system that, as you say, still exists in the United States.
Worldwide.
Worldwide, absolutely. When we saw this worldwide movement to take statues down, and in South Africa, in Belgium, in Congo, in the United States, and in lots of places, is that what needs to happen? Because we saw this sort of revolutionary movement, in a way, after George Floyd was killed. George Floyd was not the first Black man who was executed, literally on video in front of our eyes. But it was not at all sure that the policeman who killed him would face real justice, would get any punishment. And now we're seeing a whole backlash after all of these protests around the world related to the injustices that people felt in their own countries. So in Nigeria, for instance, it was Black Lives Matter, but it was about SARS and the very violent police force. But now we're seeing the complete opposite, where all of these laws are being put in place to make sure that people don't know any of the history. Where is that, how do we take the tearing down of the monuments and trying to have people understand, is that just performative?
Well, it depends on the country. Like in Indonesia, toppling statues, it's a different context than in the Netherlands. Because in Indonesia, they had a revolution. In the Netherlands, there never have been a revolution over there. So now we have this movement also in the Netherlands to topple statues, to remove colonial symbols, but I'm against that because toppling statues is a revolutionary act, and it belongs in the final stage. Just like in after the Second World War with Nazi Germany, the statues were toppled, they were removed, and in Indonesia, the statues of Jan Pieter Soenkoen was being removed, but in the Netherlands, they never had that, never had a revolution. So to remove that, it is. Again, it's an update of a system, so I'm against it. It doesn't do anything about anti-colonization, and the people in Indonesia, the people across the ocean, they don't benefit from a statue being removed in the Netherlands, so I'm very against that. There has to be some more anti-colonial work first, and then after, otherwise it's indeed performative. Maybe
in Brussels, a dialogue can be started. But in the Netherlands, there's not even, it seems, a real dialogue about what happened in Indonesia and what happened in Suriname or what happened to other locations where the Dutch colonized.
Yeah.
I'm really concerned about the lack of teaching of history globally. And, one of the reasons that people say there was accountability for the Holocaust was because the Germans documented everything so carefully. Whereas we don't have that with the Congo or with Indonesia. Not that there are no documents, but not by the colonizing state.
Yeah, because they took possession of the knowledge production.
Right. So how do we start making that difference globally? With the teaching of history from a wider perspective than not just the vanquerer, but a more truthful history. Enslaved people were not just happy living on the farm.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I'm like a grassroots organizer. So I think it's important to do some community building, to create our own platforms, because we're being erased by the established powers, by the media, by academics. So that means we have to create our own space. We don't, we can focus on getting space from those who are established, but that is not in their interests. Because they are in power because of these colonial structures, and that's why it is very important to create our own space, to create to not give our power away, and you see a lot of times when activists they put certain topics on the agenda. I did it also in my activist background. We did protest. We made a lot of people mad, but they started to talk about topics they never talked about. But here is where the how do you say it, the difficult part begins, because when the topics about colonialism is finally discussed about, it gets co-opted by corporations or academics, and it is like that is, and activists, activists actually has to move outside the system, but they are also trying to survive inside the system. So when they get paid by, some established powers, then our movement gets co-opted. So that's why I think it's very important to create a strong community and our own platforms.
Let me see if there are any questions from the audience, so that we can focus on other aspects that you might want to ask our two esteemed speakers.
I have a question.
Sure, could you stand up and just introduce yourself?
Hi everyone, my name is Tony Prosper. I'm a second year PhD student at the School of Information. And this is I have two questions. Feel free to answer either one of them. But the first question is, and respond to like the conversation that's happening right now. So my question is like, how do we get different like members of like communities to be in solidarity together? So for example, I'm noticing like there's this opposition being placed between academics and activists, right? Like, in what ways can academics and activists and other groups, right, of society work together for a common goal? That's the first question. And then the second question is a very simple question, is like, what are some of the major obstacles that you're facing, right?
Could you say that again, the last part?
What are some of the major obstacles that you're currently facing?
I will let you answer both, and then also allow you to answer, because as a real academic, but also an academic with a background in anthropology, I find that very interesting that you're trying to listen to the people, because that's what you're studying, and you were listening to the people and going out and actively doing it in a very different way. So
yeah, so it's indeed very difficult to create solidarity between different movements. But first, we have all these individuals, they have to organize themselves in organizations, and between these organizations, there has to be, they have to be linked with each other, and actually, there should be some education about how this oppression is connected with each other by one system, and that is how we will connect with each other as different movements. And what was the other question?
And what are some of the challenges that some of the real obstacles that you face?
Yes, that right now in the activist movements, a lot of people are into intersectionality, about identity politics, but they are not. Okay. Intersectionality and identity politics is not an analysis of a system. I think it's very dangerous because it can update the system. Actually, we have to focus more on the history of colonialism and imperialism. Otherwise, you get all these sellouts in your movements because they weren't trying to survive within the system. So that's very hard. And also the divide and conquer of hundreds of years of colonialism is also, we have lived in different worlds for hundreds of years, especially in my community, in Indonesian community. We got like the Indonesians, we got the Indo people, we got the Moluccan people. We really lived in different worlds for hundreds of years. So we need education on that, yeah.
Okay. Yes, please, Anne-Marie.
Comment on this.
Please.
So, since I do this a lot in the program, I couldn't agree with you more. It's actually, part of it is to start to really relativize what your expertise is, and to realize that if you are interested in bringing in activists, it's not about you bringing them to your table. It's about giving them power to start designing what this education actually looks like. And that's a very different dynamic than sort of this idea of diversity and bringing people to what is still your table, right? And so I think there's something very, very important about trying to have other people actually start to design, and I mean literally design and redesign what your education is. Since you have the platform and the power to, you know, and institutions behind you. Mm-hmm. And that's a very different way of thinking.
Right. I see one question in the back, and I'm conscious of time because we started late, so maybe we will take this as the last question.
My name is Stephanie Vidaye Gelderloos, and I'm actually in the faculty from English in our Flint campus. I would like to thank you both for coming. I especially wanted to thank Christa for sharing the stories of her family's trauma. I understand that's your why, and I understand that's your power. But I also understand that sharing trauma of your family can be traumatizing. So I appreciate you sharing that with us. I do have a question, though. I was particularly moved by the way you brought soil from Indonesia to your great-grandparents' graves in Suriname. It was like a simple but beautiful and profound way to try to correct or even a small way to begin to heal the great wrongs that had been done upon them. So I guess I kind of wanted to hear a little more about like what that gesture meant to you, such a small gesture in the face of such great wrongs.
I didn't understand the last part of that.
She just wanted to understand what bringing the soil meant to you in light of the great injustices that may be simple act, but not so simple.
Yeah, it meant a lot to me to go back to Indonesia for the first time, because it is land trauma. We are taken away from our lands, from Indonesia and from Suriname. So when I went back to Indonesia, I was there for like 30 minutes, and I don't know what happened to me, but when I arrived in the land and I walked on the same ground as my ancestors did, I received immediately answers on questions I have never asked myself. Like, I should stop with what I'm doing in activist and go another way, and that I have to leave the country. I have to migrate to another country, and that I would never have thought doing that. And I just wanted to go to Indonesia. I just wanted to see. While I was in the plane, also while I was in the plane to Suriname, I just wanted to see the distance of these countries, and just sitting in plane is much faster, but just to see how big the ocean is between Suriname and the Netherlands, it really touched me that my great-grandparents were kidnapped. They left 2 children behind, and they didn't knew where they were going, and they thought they would be back in Indonesia, but they could never go back. So to me, it was, I felt like their emotions, but it was also my own emotions, because in our culture, ancestors are very important, and you know, we are our ancestors, and yeah, I don't know. I also feel like much more connected with them since I've been to Indonesia and to Suriname to their graves, and I did this. So it's very, I can talk about this for a long time, but it was very, yeah, it touched me. Also to be in a country where everyone looks like you, it's very, it's so
empowering.
Yeah, but it's also healing. Mm-hmm. to be in a country where everyone looks like you and you're not like that alien out of context. So it did a lot to me, yeah, to connect. Yeah.
I want to thank you also for the question, because one thing that I find interesting, both of you have connections to these homelands, to the Congo, for you to Indonesia and to Suriname, and that ability to go home, I think, is really powerful. And I know for me personally, it's something that I lack, because I don't know where home in Africa is. And so I appreciate that. But I also want to say, was there something that led you to the soil? Because I have the sense, and I may be wrong, that it was some instinct in you. It was not like, I know when I get there, this is what I'm going to do.
No, I didn't plan at all to go to Indonesia, and I didn't plan to go to Suriname. It just came on my path.
But the soil,
Yeah,
and
so I just took it. I thought this is where my great grandparents are from. This is where their house was built, and I have to take it. I also never want to leave Indonesia again, so that's why I just wanted to have something with me.
I think, to me, this seems, I'm speaking completely off the cuff, but it seems almost like something that is handed down from our ancestors, that we don't know why, but that it's important. And in all of my years in Africa, one of the things that is consistently done is when you share a meal, a drink in particular, it doesn't have to really be alcohol, is you provide a little bit for the ancestors to water the soil. People like us don't necessarily know that, and that was not something that, again, has been transferred. Well, I want to thank all of you so much for participating and being here, and a special, really big thanks to our two presenters, Christa and Bambi. Thank you so much for sharing your wisdom and your experiences with us. And thank you to the program, Anna Marie, both of you, for organizing this and the exhibit. Thank you.